In 1582, the Jesuit priest Antonio Pozovino arrived in Moscow on a diplomatic mission to meet Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible of Russia. His task was given him by Pope Gregory XIII, the same pope who introduced the modern Gregorian calendar, the one Russia only converted to in 1917. And his mission was no less than to heal the schism of the Orthodox and Catholic churches, to bring Russia into line and back into the one true faith, into, if you like, the Catholic rules-based order. But Antonio Pozovino was dreadfully uninformed about the reality of Russia, and his dialogue with Ivan the Terrible about the Orthodox faith and its attitude to the Roman Pope went dreadfully wrong. At one point, Antonio Pozovino later wrote in his memoir, "The Prince Ivan the Terrible flew into a rage and stood right up from his throne. Everyone was sure that he would strike and kill me, as he had others, including even his own son, with the iron-tipped staff he carries the way the Pope does his pastoral rod." Quoting Ivan, Pozovino wrote, "There are peasants outside," he cried, "who would show you what it means to talk to me like a peasant." Was this account of a Western European diplomat to Russia in the 16th century true, or was it one of many examples of the black legend of Russian history as applied to Ivan the Terrible? That is the question on today's Burning Archive. So welcome everyone to the Burning Archive. I am Jeff Rich. I am obviously a podcaster, but I am also a writer, historian, and now retired government official looking for some other form of employment. So do help me out by sharing and liking and showing your support for the Burning Archive podcast. And this podcast is my latest in a series on the black legend of Russian history, which is a sort of term coined by the historian Mark B. Smith in his book, The Russia Anxiety, which is sort of the story of dark autocracy dominating Russian history. And we've talked about the difficult 20th century for Russia, the golden age of the 19th century, in War and Peace. We've talked about the remarkable Russian Enlightenment of the 18th century, Peter the Great, and most remarkably still, Catherine the Great, and the great polymath Lomonosov. And last time we spoke about the extraordinary stories related to the time of troubles, false Dmitri, Boris Godunov, and the murder mysteries. And the time of troubles were kicked off to some degree by the actions and the legacy and the difficult situations created by the topic of today's podcast, which I'm going to do over 2 episodes because this topic, this individual is so enormous, so mythic, so legendary, and so important to the black legend of Russian history that he kind of deserves at least 2 episodes. And that person is Ivan IV, Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible. And like, I guess, Genghis Khan, Ivan the Terrible is one of those villains of history who is certainly has a track record of cruel and difficult acts, but whose is poorly understood. But he is also someone where it is difficult to disentangle man and myth. And the myth is fundamental to the black legend of Russian history, because Ivan the Terrible was a cruel autocrat and a zealous advocate of absolute power, I guess. Whether he succeeded in his ambitions is another question. Who killed many, many people, and quite likely had some form of mental illness, although of course it's impossible to really know at the distance of nearly 500 years. But he also implemented a reign of terror, I guess, which a very unique and enigmatic institution called the Oprichnina, which operated for 7 years in Russia, which was a kind of almost like a death cult almost, but also a kind of, has often been presented as a proto KGB Stalinist terror. And so he is often twinned in portraits of Russian history together with this sort of line of successors of cruel autocrats, Ivan the Terrible, Stalin, and more recently Vladimir Putin. And of course I'm not saying that Ivan was a saint, but as we learned in the first episode on the Black Legend of Russian history, a lot of this talk about Russian history has geopolitical colouring, ideological colouring, Russophobic colouring, and other prejudice to it, and that is equally true of Ivan the Terrible. And then what's more, Ivan the Terrible is also simply a very difficult person and individual to understand. Some of the things that he did, like the Oprichnina, are just genuinely almost, my God, how do you explain this? He abdicated twice, once with a sort of almost like a kind of a installing almost like a puppet king in his place. He did all sorts of very strange and difficult things to understand, and understandably, as a result of that, historians offer wildly different interpretations of whether what he did made any sense at all, whether it was simple madness, whether it was simple cruelty, whether it represented the true darkness of the Russian soul, or the true darkness of the autocratic Russian state, or whether it was all a big, chaotic, erratic attempt to deal with some very difficult problems, some of which perhaps were even shared with the other Eurasian states of the period. So inherently, he is a difficult person to understand. So we should realize that many of the confident interpretations and the cliched images that are presented can easily descend into dogmatic interpretations of what are actually deep, deep enigmas. And this is partly what makes him fascinating, I guess. How do you explain what the hell he did, and how do you sort of solve it? And then it's made even more difficult to understand things because so much, there is so little solid, grounded historical documentation and evidence for his life and his motives and the explanations of his conduct. So just for example, the little excerpt that I read from the Moscovia of Antonio Posavino, which is his his diplomatic report to the Pope in the 1580s on his diplomatic mission to Russia. Well, I mean, that is his account, and he said in his account that he was sure that the Tsar was about to kill him, but was that just Antonio Posavino, who, after all, had demonstrated a profound ignorance of the Russian state, the Russian culture, the Russian history, which is why he had so deeply offended Ivan the Terrible, that he should stand up in his chair and say, "Stop talking to me like that," even to the point of just assuming that Russia was ready to give up the Orthodox faith because the Pope wanted them to do so. Can we really rely on Antonio Posavino's account? And another example, there are some famous letters written by Ivan the Terrible to Prince Andrei Kurbsky. And from those letters is where we learn a lot of Ivan the Terrible's childhood and his experiences and his views on various matters. But there was at least one eminent American Russian scholar of Russia, Edward Kennan, who claimed that these letters were later forgeries and that one could not say anything on the basis of Ivan, or say anything about Ivan the Terrible on the basis of him. And in fact, he went even further and asserted confidently that Ivan the Terrible was illiterate. He could not possibly have written such powerful and extraordinary letters. Now, I'm not saying that, in fact, most scholars now discount Edward Kennan's view, and of course he articulated this view in the 1960s and the 1970s in the height of the Cold War, so perhaps there were some socio-historical cultural context for what he was claiming, but it just goes to show the sheer uncertainty. There are just so many things about Ivan's life and his motives and his ideas and his actions that it's sort of seen through a glass darkly. But that simply makes him a more fascinating figure for people interested in history because, well, he clearly is a crucial figure who had an enormous impact on people, who was a larger-than-life character. And yet, how do we make sense of what the hell he's doing and how do we explain it? And it's also all happening at a really crucial time in Russian history. So Ivan the Terrible occupies this absolutely pivotal moment in Russian history where I guess he is the first ruler of Russia who claims the title of Tsar, which is a kind of a Russian version of Caesar, as in a Roman emperor, and to some degree sees himself as the successor to the Byzantine Roman emperor, and who both gathers together the various Russian principalities of Moscow and Novgorod and Tver and Ryazan and Vladimir and all those sort of places, as well as expands Russia to the south and to the east. In fact, the first really big inways into Siberia, bringing Siberia under clear Russian administrative control, is in Ivan the Terrible's reign. So it's an absolutely pivotal moment in Russian history. He's clearly a larger-than-life figure. His actions are strange to some degree. They readily attract that question-begging term evil, but they are clearly violent and disordered, but they also in many ways seem to be quite effective. So how can we actually find some sort of coherent explanation for all of this, but without turning Ivan into some caricature out of the Black Legend or some cartoon villain, which, to be frank, so much of the Anglo-American historical tradition tends to do. So one of the ways in which you can kind of do that is to have a bit of a look at some of the historical setting of Russia at the time, and to see Ivan as perhaps a bit on the extreme of the continuum of violence, sure, but also in a way part of, on the continuum of ways of exercising power and building states in the 16th century. In a way, he was a not atypical European Renaissance or even Eurasian Renaissance prince. And this is the kind of approach taken by the great biographer of Ivan the Terrible, Isabella de Madariaga. As she says in the biography, she has tried to write the history of Ivan IV standing in Moscow and looking out over the walls of the Kremlin towards the rest of Europe, and not looking in and down into Russia over its western border from the outside. Adopting such an approach makes it easier to avoid supercilious judgments, to grasp what happened in Russia in Russian terms, to feel its full tragedy. She also comments that the problems that faced Ivan IV as ruler were not so different from those that faced France, Germany, and to a lesser degree England. England, after all, was in a pretty turbulent state in the Elizabethan, pre-Elizabethan, and post-Elizabethan era, and Ivan the Terrible was a contemporary, indeed a correspondent with Queen Elizabeth I of England. And even just thinking about cruelties and massacres, and we'll certainly cover those when I give a bit of a narrative of Ivan's life. Even on this program, on the Burning Archive program, you might recall the episode on the Medicis, which was episode number 53 in May 2022. That talked about the Medici, who, there were some pretty bad Medici popes, and there was, of course, the quite fascinating and significant figure, Catherine de' Medici, who had a major cultural influence, but who also was behind the St. Bartholomew's massacre in Paris, which killed thousands and thousands of people, which happened 2 years after Ivan the Terrible's infamous and cruel massacre of the citizens of Novgorod in 1570. So we're not drawing moral equivalences and all that, but again, I guess we need to see these events in a balanced comparative perspective without the Black Legend. of Russian history. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is provide a bit of a narrative account of this incredible figure after sort of introducing his, I guess, just the enigma and fascination about him, and some of his sort of the importance of the myths about Ivan the Terrible to the historiography and the popular culture around Ivan the Terrible, and the importance of sort of seeing him in a more realistic historical setting. A very complex historical setting, because as we've discussed, Russia was not just a European state, it was a state actively involved with the Ottomans, the Crimean Tatars, the sort of Central Asia, Siberia, and all the rest of it. So it was really, even then, a Eurasian power. So I'm going to give a bit of a narrative account and sort of summarize some of those key themes in this episode. And then in the next episode, I'm going to talk about some underlying common themes, I guess, in the story of Ivan the Terrible, and why he is so fascinating.